This week's new jobs report shows another 1 million unemployment claims were filed as the country continues to battle several different crises. The number is slightly down from last week's report and is still a significant drop from March and April unemployment numbers. With us now for more is Optimal Capital Director of Strategy, Frances Stacy. So, Frances, we are seeing a second week of unemployment claims at 1 million. What can you tell us about those numbers? How should we be looking at them?
Well, the thing is now it's not really so much from my viewpoint about what the numbers are week to week to week at this level, as you say, because now it's becoming about how prolonged these numbers are becoming, right? We're in our 24th week of this since the pandemic hit. And most states, and I don't know if people are thinking with this quite yet, most states do not pay beyond 26 weeks. So now we're running into that deadline where people are maybe going to lose their eligibility. So that's a whole new problem on the horizon.
Another number that we ask you about is the continuous claims report. That number is also dropping, but I guess I don't know. I never know how to talk to you about these numbers because I never know what they really mean because they're dropping, but they're still uncomfortably high. But what do you make of that?
Well, it's good news that they're dropping. I mean, we would be having a different conversation if these things were going up and up and up and up and up. And on sort of the surface of it, it's saying that, reversing the reopenings and kind of having some more of those shutdowns and those pocket sort of hot button areas for the virus didn't change this curve remarkably well. We only had 1 week where this curve kind of changed and they went higher. So on the surface, that's very good news. But underlying all of that, as this is being prolonged, you have 62% of small businesses don't think that they can make it if some kind of normalcy doesn't come by the end of the year. You have 26.5% of homeowners and renters thinking they can't make their payment next month. That's a census survey. And so you have this sort of backdrop of all this potential doom and gloom. You've got all these loans in forbearance, and you just don't know what percentage of those. I mean, on the positive side, we could sail through that and say, okay, people are just not paying their mortgages because they don't have to, and that's a large percentage. Okay, great. And then we're not going to have problems in the credit markets. But if a larger percentage of the 8.2% of mortgages that are currently in forbearance end up defaulting, then you have a different problem. And there's no way for us to really know what percentage of those people are actually going to go into default territory come this fall when forbearance ends. And there's no way of really knowing if forbearance is going to be extended by policymakers.
Frances, let me ask you about the hurricane. Hurricane Laura, as you know, is hitting the Gulf where there are hundreds of oil rigs. Can we expect to see a dip in oil prices after this hurricane passes?
Well, it's interesting because the stores are unusually high. You remember when the pandemic hit, they wanted to cut production, and so the stores got very, very high. I don't know that Hurricane Laura is going to have a long-term effect on prices. They did try to prepare the best they could by, locking up whatever they could. If it hurts the infrastructure, we certainly have some stores. Generally speaking, so I don't know that we're going to have too much supply chain disruption. But generally speaking, we are going to have inflation. We're having inflation. Food costs are going up. Healthcare costs are going up. The Fed came out this morning and said, now we're going to average inflation. We're not going to stop us at that 2% target. They're going to try to run hot with inflation. And so generally under that environment, oil prices will continue to go higher. And what's really interesting about what the Fed, a lot of people thought that what the Fed did this morning was highly surprising. They don't have a choice. We have a record amount of leverage in the system. And we saw what happened in 2018, the end of 2018, when they tightened too much for the amount of leverage in the system. And so because we have so much leverage in the system, they cannot tighten, which reduces the money supply right now. So this is not a surprising announcement from the Fed. And I do think over the longer term, oil prices will fall in line with that overall economic policy.
Frances, I think that that's really great what you just said, and I'm just going to use like sort of common people language. But it's essentially, the government is helping to flood the country with money. People are getting unemployment checks. There's the PPP money, but when you have money coming in, then the price of things go up. And I'm wondering though what that means, because while there's money that's sort of keeping the heart pumping I'm just probably going to mix metaphors, but while there's money pumping in, keeping things going, there's so much uncertainty. There's all this social unrest that we're watching in the streets. We're on the eve of an election. People don't know if they'll be able to return to work the way they had been before, because they don't know if their kids are going to school or if their kids are going to stay in school. So I wonder if people like you, as you watch these things happening, if there's a concern that prices will continue to rise because there's money in the system, and we'll hit this wall because of all these other things that are making just daily life very uncertain.
Yes, so your analogies are great. they're as good as any of mine. But that's the thing, right? So when you flood the system with money, prices do go up, and that, as we've been discussing, the wealth gap and other things, that affects a certain percentage of people in a positive way, people in the stock market, people who have assets, and it affects the other part of the other end of the spectrum in a negative way, because now not only are you hurting, your cost of living is going up. And, for instance, small businesses, the cost of, restaurants are obviously struggling where they are open. They have 50% capacity, and the price of steak and cheese has doubled. And that's exactly what happens when you flood the economy. As to the uncertainty, that's sort of, I think, what's happened is we've put so much money in the system, and you can't really pull it back. We had this discussion when the extra $600 a week in unemployment insurance was expiring. You can't really pull it back because you don't know how many people that's going to squash, right? So you have to let it run a little bit hot for a while until you can get certainty in some of these areas of uncertainty. Because really what's overall uncertain, which is everything that you mentioned, is that we don't know what effects from COVID are temporary as far as employment and schools and jobs and moving out of the cities and what have you, and what of that is temporary. Was there sort of an overcorrection into suburbia, and when Broadway opens, New York is going to come back? Does that happen over 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, right? And so in the short term, you got to let things run hot. You got to give as much assistance as possible. And then I think policymakers have to parse through each of the points of data, and where they can really tell who's not getting a job because they have too much assistance, who is really at risk for foreclosure and or eviction. And you kind of, as you get more of those data points, you can kind of make monetary and fiscal policy more specific. But until then, I think you err on the side of caution and give as much assistance as possible. Not a perfect world, no perfect answers, but that's sort of what I'm thinking in the short term.
All right. Hey, I know we say this every time, but I love talking to you because I feel like you take these sort of complicated concepts and you just speak in regular people language. Really appreciate it. Frances Stacy, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.